My name is Michael Albert, and I'm the host of the podcast that's titled RevolutionZ. This is our 302nd consecutive episode, and our guest is Max Elbaum, here for a second time to talk about election 2024 and beyond, and I guess whatever else comes up. Max has been involved in peace, anti-racist, and radical movements since joining Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, in Madison, Wisconsin in the 1960s. Through the 1970s and 1980s, he was active in then widespread efforts to build a new U.S. Revolutionary Party, and in the 1990s, he was the editor of Crossroads, which was a magazine that featured dialogue and debate among socialists from different radical political traditions. In 2001, he was among the founders of War Times, a free bilingual in-print tabloid that was distributed nationwide, and until 2011, an online information and analysis project. Max is currently a member of the Convergence magazine editorial board. He is also a co-editor with Linda Burnham and Maria Poble, I'm not sure you pronounce her name, of Power Concedes Nothing, How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections. So, Max, welcome back to Revolution Z.
Thanks, Michael. Always stimulating to talk to you.
It was only Excuse me?
It's always stimulating to talk to you.
I'm a virtual drug. It was only a few weeks ago that we talked last on an episode, and yet quite a bit has happened, I guess. Where to start this time? Perhaps have you had any new feelings about the coming election or how to relate to it?
Well, I think since we talked last time, what's interesting to me, the Kamala bump plateaued, and then after the debate seems to have picked up again. But at the same time, Kamala is shifting a little bit in her what seemed to be her initial political motion, not in the good direction from our point of view. And I think that it's not a done deal yet. There's still a lot of time and a lot of cross pressures will be brought to bear and should be brought to bear from our end on the campaign. But it's the interesting thing is that Biden being replaced by Kamala has given a big boost to the anti-MAGA front. It's definitely increased the chances of beating Trump. But at the same time, it's strengthened the more centrist wing of the anti-MAGA front. Biden was very weak and susceptible to a lot of pressures, and Kamala is not feeling that kind of weakness right now. So that makes for a complicated set of things for the left to navigate.
Yeah, I think that's true. After the convention, she was up, I don't know, 3, 4, even 5 points. Then a few weeks later, let's say the day before the debate, she was tied and down. And the thing that I found weird was, okay, how did that happen? In other words, how did she lose those points in that intermediate time when he was doing nothing? I mean, Trump wasn't really doing anything. At least I wasn't discerning anything. And yet she was losing those points. And then the debate, she's bounced back up again. But, if that gap could be closed between the convention and the debate, it can also be closed between the debate and the election. So it's not over. I agree with you. And it's hard to, in some moments I try to interpret her words to give us the best chance while keeping my eyes open. So when you do that around the sort of military stuff, and the sort of patriotism stuff, do you have any way of interpreting that other than horribly. I'm not sure I'm getting across.
Yeah, you're getting across. I mean, this is the biggest problem we've faced, and it's a reflection of a problem we've faced since the resistance to Trump. Um, the side of peace and internationalism, up until the uprising of anti-genocide again around Palestine, has been the weakest part of the progressive movement resistance, and it's also the part that the is held the most closely by the ruling class in the executive branch, and is even protected from a lot of congressional oversight. So, foreign policy is a very tough nut to crack, even under better circumstances than we have. And I think for people our age, they can't help but feel some echoes with the 1960s and the Lyndon Johnson era on this, which is in the first years of the Johnson administration, 63, 64, 65, really, really breakthroughs on certain issues, domestic issues. I mean, that was when the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the end of racist immigration quotas, the beginning of Medicare. I mean, these were second Reconstruction, finally breaking the white monopoly on political power. But in terms of foreign policy, we had the steady escalation of Vietnam, which undermined so much of that in terms of building a progressive movement that was durable and that could, move towards some kind of in the direction of political power. And of course, was a disaster for the Vietnamese and, for all the carnage that it caused in the United States as well as around the world. So there's an echo of that, which is that the Kamala foreign policy looks terrible right now. I mean, there's a few issues on which it's not as bad as Trump, but it's a definitely imperial hegemony project that she's buying into. And it's going to be very complicated to navigate that. The domestic stuff that is in her program is nowhere near as much to the left as those early years of the Johnson administration, although there are some good things there, and there's some things about voting rights, reproductive rights, defense of the LGBTQ community, even a few economic issues on which it's going to make a difference. Probably the biggest thing on that is the support for the trade union movement, and hopefully that will continue in a way that will allow the momentum of the last few years toward revitalizing labor to continue, which is of great strategic importance for the left. But on foreign policy, we're going to have a hell of a time, and it's dividing people going into the election. It's going to be difficult to keep that fight going during the electoral season, to keep hammering them on U.S. complicity with Israeli genocide. Look what just happened. We're on the verge of once again threatening a regional war in the Middle East. And then, of course, after the election, whoever wins.
Yeah, we agree, but there's one interpretation, let's call it, of what was done at the convention around patriotism and all the flags and all the whatnot, and then subsequently talking about the American military, that I'd almost like to think was the explanation, but I think it's probably giving them too much strategic credit for themselves. That is, the Democrats. And that is, um, on November 10th, where the military's feelings are may matter. Might not, but it may matter greatly. I'm assuming if Trump loses. And I, for one, would be okay with some rhetoric like that for the purpose of defusing military anger over Trump's loss. I doubt that's what's going on, but I sort of like to think that's what's going on, because it would mean that rhetoric wasn't in fact a very intentional, defense of existing policies, but was rather a sort of a strategic step. The funny thing is that you sort of feel like you don't know what anything means, right? In other words, is what they're saying reflective of some weird thing, or is it reflective of some strange strategy, or is it just opportunism, or is it really a commitment to imperial success? I don't feel like I know. I mean, I know what we know because we understand the system, but not because we understand the particular people. Um, I'm not sure it matters what the particular people think at some level. Uh,
Yeah, well, it matters on some level. I mean, individuals make certain decisions, and
some difference.
within the limits of the structural constraints. I mean, the fact, for example, that Biden somehow, typical of many politicians of his generation, even who weren't Jewish. I mean, Biden is a Zionist in a way that Kamala is not, or in a way that Obama wasn't.
Yeah,
There's a certain, and that certainly has made a difference in how the degree of U.S. complicity. It's probably, I mean, the U.S.-Israel alliance, it's going to take a few more
it
steps.
may have.
Yeah, it's going to take more steps to break it
It
up
may have.
altogether.
But we don't know.
Yeah, there's no way to know for sure,
Yeah,
but I think I
yeah,
think I think there are elements of it that Biden made a difference who he was, but we'll have to
yeah,
see
yeah,
what happens under Kamala. I think what your point on,
yeah,
I think Kamala is trying to make nice with the generals in the military. So I do think that's
yeah.
one element of what's going on, but I don't think it's the only element of what's going on.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I'd agree with that. Um, there's another. I also don't think that the election has been won. I mean, it could still be won by Trump, as hard as that is to grok. And yet, I have sort of shifted a little bit in one sense. The day after the election, if it's still roughly 50-50, and both sides are aroused, that's not a very auspicious situation for the next 4 years or for the future or whatever you want to say. There has to be an effort to uh, reduce support for Trumpism, not just to beat it or to stop it, but to reduce support for it. And
Absolutely.
it seems to me that needs to become a part of a priority.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Yeah.
Instead
Absolutely.
of sort of, it's,
Yeah. I
and that's
mean,
not fully understood on the left, I don't think.
no, it's not, and you're right
But
about how important it is. I mean, first of all, the election is a long ways from being won. Voter suppression, political threats of political violence, which could influence the vote, as well as the effort to protect the vote afterwards. The twists and turns of surprises. You've got many international actors and U.S. actors who are invested in a Trump victory, and they haven't used everything in their arsenal yet. It's October surprise kind of things, crises in various
yeah,
places. So this is going to be an extremely tough election, uh, even to win. Uh, it's still going to come down to 6 or 7 swing states, and as Michael Podhorzer, who writes
although
a lot about the election, it's the margin of effort, not the margin of error in the polls. So that's number one.
the
Defending the election is going to be extremely difficult. That this article in the New York Times day before yesterday or yesterday about Robert's role in creating the immunity decision for Trump. and it's been written about since then, both on the, especially Ellie Mistel in The Nation wrote a piece about it. The degree to which the Supreme Court is partisan and absolutely the majority ignores originalism, conservatism. It's all bullshit. They're in the partisan camp right now. And so Trump's efforts to throw the election to the Supreme Court or into the House of Representatives, these things are going to be very complicated after November.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you said is
I mean,
important about weakening Trump. That's reasons why you need to win a landslide. You need to take the House and the Senate. And you need to start passing some legislation that neutralizes or wins over some of the MAGA people, or at least some of the
yeah.
Republicans who are going along with MAGA. I mean,
Or even
this
some of the MAGA people, I think.
it's not going to be done by argument. At a certain point, you need to have enough political power to give enough goodies to elements of their coalition that they decide it's not worth it to keep playing the degree of opposition, that they can get something out of it by at least becoming neutral, if not moving to your side. So otherwise, we're in trench warfare for
Yeah.
decades.
But I'm inclined to think, maybe this is again wishful thinking, but I'm inclined to think that a lot of Trump's support is thin. That is, it's support for my team. It's a support for the game that's being played. It's a support for not violating what I'm supposed to be for, what my neighborhoods are for, and so on. And I see it cracking somewhat. It's hard to tell whether the polls are real. I mean, I find myself like them, suspicious of everything. But the polls that are being done, for instance, in Iowa, where there's this big shift, it can only have happened by a loss of votes for Trump. So you do see that happening in various places, not enough, but happening. And one wonders, where it will go.
Well, I think we're we're radicals, so we have to believe that people can change their minds. Otherwise, there's no point in doing politics if you think people can't change, and that includes change in the coalitions that are on the other side. I mean, when I was in SDS,
Sure.
there were by 1969, there were people in my SDS chapter who had voted, who's were Wallace supporters in 1964, and they changed their mind over the course of a few years. So we have to be able to change the minds of some of those people who are voting Republican. I think you're right. It's very difficult to assess how much that's happening now, and
It's hard.
it's not related directly to people's stances on certain issues like defense of Social Security or what do you think about health care or whatever. MAGA has built up a certain kind of sense of community and belonging among many of its supporters, which goes beyond the question
Yeah.
of its political program. I mean, those white evangelical
Yeah.
churches, it's not held together exactly by a political program in the sense of a platform of a set of policies. There's a certain sense of those other people are other, and we're the
It
real Americans. And breaking that up is tricky.
it's it, it's even more, I think, because it's not necessarily material. I mean, there's a strange dynamic. I mean, consider the immigration issue, which is a big part of what's going on. It's not like a sidebar. It's a serious part of all of what's going on. And look at the way Trump addresses it. He doesn't spend much time on what are the material implications for your pocketbook of immigration. What he really is saying is what's happening to your community by the influx of people who have a different culture. That's ultimately what he's saying, right? They eat cats and dogs. Okay, so that's over the top, but that's what he's communicating, that our communities are at risk of losing their identity. Uh, and it isn't even necessarily, you don't have to feel like, and I watch these interviews of these folks, you don't have to feel like they're scum, they're bad, they're all the stuff he says. You don't have to feel all that, and a lot of them don't. But you can feel like a large influx of people is going to change the character of our community to something that's really unfamiliar to me, and I don't want that.
Yep.
And the left doesn't address this stuff, and doesn't even try to address this stuff, I don't think, and it's a mistake.
It is a mistake, and it's a
Because it
global.
is,
It's
it's
throughout
important.
the global north.
Yeah,
This is what's happening in England. This is
yeah,
what's happening in France. This
yeah,
is the structural underpinnings of the exploitation, climate change, and war, forcing people out of their homes in the global south, fleeing to the global north, and people in the global north then saying, oh, these people are coming just what you said. Even ones who aren't haters think, well, they're different and it's just going to cause
yeah,
problems. I don't like it, So,
yeah.
and the left hasn't figured
And you
out
can't
how to,
dismiss that.
yeah, you can't put
Yeah, because you
everyone in the
can't, it's
bucket of
not
being
trivial. You can't
deplorable.
just dismiss it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So
If
the
if
politics
you
of that
just
are very
say,
complicated.
if you just say, if you just argue over whether immigration is going to increase or decrease the well-being of the economy, as if that itself says anything to anybody, you're not really addressing what may well be driving the hostility and the anger and the forming of you know a wall around people. Uh, it's a hard nut to crack, but you can't crack it at all if you don't even aim at it. If you, it's uh,
Yeah.
it's a
Well,
real issue.
also, it is also, and there are, there have been different ways to try to crack that nut. And one of them, which I think is true, it's not the only one, it's when people are feeling more secure economically, the arguments around immigration, like, when Trump was first dividing families at the border, there was a wave of humanitarian outrage about that treatment
Right.
from people who felt all different things about immigration as an issue. Uh, when you're feeling in a situation where you can empathize and you're not feeling like your own situation is totally precarious, it's easier to appeal to people's better angels. And I think that's going to be an important part of if there is a democratic administration, and if the left is able to put enough pressure on it that it at least begins to move a little bit on some of these issues and tilts more in the direction of a working class oriented populism than just trying to recreate the coalition of middle upper class professionals. When in our conversation last time when you brought up the coordinator class and so on, if it goes in that
Yeah.
direction and actually produces some benefits, and particularly if it strengthens the labor movement, uh, then you have a chance to move people. You have a chance to move people on
Yeah.
economic grounds, humanitarian grounds, and you begin to get a solidarity kind of injury to one, injury to all, which
Yeah.
ultimately you have to be
Yeah.
able to do that. And the labor
Yeah.
movement turned really in the 1980s, 70s, 80s. There was a shift in the realization of trying to organize immigrants and the role that immigrants played in revitalizing some of the unions that were dead in the water then, made a difference. And I think that is going to be a key element if we make it through the
Yeah.
election and the election protection. we have to be
Right.
thinking in those
If
terms.
I had been hoping that the vice presidential nominee would be Sean Fain. Um, uh, I thought that would have been a big deal. Would have made a difference in the election and would have made a difference in the aftermath, and at least wasn't inconceivable. Of course, it didn't happen. Tim Walz isn't that bad. I've heard him now, watching things on YouTube and stuff. He is very effective. So that's you can just see him getting across to people. Um, so that's
Well,
pretty
I'm a big Sean Fain
positive.
fan too. Although I think we're better off with him as the president of the UAW for the next 4 years.
It may
His
be.
point. This is a very interesting point for 2028. If we make it through 2024, he's got this program of trying to get all the unions to build contract expiration dates on May Day 2028. And
Right.
2028 is also a presidential election. It's going to be very
Right.
complicated. But if someone ran for president, tried to play the role that Bernie Sanders did in 2016 and 2020, and somehow tried to synergize their campaign with what the UAW is trying to do for May Day 2028 and identify with that motion and identify with that May Day event, you could see a certain kind of coalition coming together that might be very powerful if the union movement, again,
Yeah.
continues its motion the way it's going. So bringing Sean Fain into the
I
conversation.
don't have any trouble seeing that. I can, it's the best of time. It's the worst of times, and it's the best of times. There's a lot going on now that is actually very good and very hopeful. I think that being one part of it, obviously, is a very significant part of it, but not alone. I mean, what the anti-Israeli, the pro-Palestinian resistance has been, to my eyes at least, quite remarkable. I was actually surprised by the extent of, I don't know what to call it, empathy, emotional empathy for for people, across the planet, all of a sudden exploding into um, a really heartfelt sentiment among young people. We hadn't seen that for a long time, and it was there. I just hope it's coming back right now. I don't know that it is, but I hope it is. Uh,
Well, it is. I think it's a sea change in terms of what you said in terms of sympathy and identification. I don't think we're going to go back to the level of demonization of Palestinians that existed before. The hard part there, of course, is what is going to institutionalize it politically and how is it going to move,
sure.
which, that is the tricky thing in terms of U.S. peace and international solidarity movements is they rise and fall, not so much in terms of people's sentiments, but in terms of the ability to make a political program and focus the energy in a way. And that's up for grabs right now. The different forces in the movement of
Right.
solidarity with Palestine have different agendas about how they think that can be institutionalized. And of course, you also run up against the problem is that
What do you think of? Let's call it an observation that the extent to which activism, arousal, let's call it, the extent to which um, being aroused and angry about injustice and so on can morph into a sustainable uh, pattern via having some institutions, etc., depends in large part on having a vision that isn't 20 minutes down the road. having a real vision for transformation of society. I mean, what we did in the 60s was impressive along many axes, but along the axis of building a sustained um, opposition that was institutionally, had an institutional basis and could persist, we were pretty terrible, ultimately. We didn't do that. And I think that it had a lot to do with the fact that we just didn't have shared vision, shared strategy, a degree of mutual trust, and a belief that you could actually win. Um, not just a short run gain, which everybody believes who tries, but a long run transformation. And I think the same situation prevails now, but maybe it will be more successful this time. Does that
Well, I
sound
think
plausible to
that's
you at all?
fundamentally
I know
right.
it's vague in general. But,
I think the tricky thing
hmm?
about that, the hardest nut to crack, maybe I'm overgeneralizing from my experience, but the hardest nut to crack is to link that vision with some kind of realistic assessment
Yeah,
of the balance of forces and where you are in that direction. I mean, one of the big problems that came out that our 60s movements in terms of institutionalizing was at least one section and a pretty large section of the people who were radicalized. We really overestimated our strength and we overestimated how close we were to
absolutely.
revolutionary change. So we built forms that were inaccessible for ordinary people, people who had to go to work every day. And we used rhetoric that implied that, revolution was around the corner. We didn't mesh our utopian vision. There were flaws in that, and I think you've done some work around trying to make our vision more concrete.
Right.
But even that aside, we didn't mesh the vision with something that was sustainable in the conditions of the 70s and so
And
on.
sensible.
Yeah, not
Yeah,
sensible.
and sensible,
And that's
suited to reality. Yeah,
and there is the same problem today because I mean, there's not that many people who think the revolution is around the corner in ways that some 60s
no,
radicals did. That's changed for the better. People realize that's not around the corner. But the level of anger and outrage is at least as great in certain sectors as it was then. And the feeling of just how screwed up everything is. I mean, people who are facing the genocide and the obscene gap between wealth and poverty in the world and in the country today, way beyond what we faced in the 1960s, way
yeah,
beyond.
it should be. Looking at those things, it should be sort of an organizer's paradise,
It
right?
should,
Not a paradise for daily life living of the population, but an organizer's paradise because everybody knows everything is broken. Everybody knows the whole system is messed up, corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And you ought to be able to talk to people and, galvanize unified activity. But the belief that that activity is going to lead somewhere and the belief that that activity is that's missing largely, at least on our side. I don't know about the right. I mean, the the worst part of the right, that is the most fundamentalist right wingers, they actually think they're going someplace, right? So they do have in mind, I think, or in their hearts. I mean, in other words, they think they're contributing to something that's going somewhere and going to win. I'm not talking about all his voters. I'm talking about I hope a small subset. But
yeah.
on the left, I don't think that's as present.
Well, this is
And
where I think on that, it depends what we measure it against. I think that there are sections of the left that have learned something from the Bernie's campaign, learned something from the resistance in 2020, And there's an increasing discussion of what the next stage of progressive politics might look like. What would
It's
it look
getting
like?
better. I agree with you.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
would it look like? Something realistic. I mean, what would it look like to pass the PRO Act, voting rights, reproductive rights, chip away at U.S. foreign policy, something that emphasizes diplomacy and peace as opposed to militarism? I think there are some programs out there. I like to use the term third reconstruction. Reverend Barber from the Poor People's Campaign uses that. It's sort of coming from Du Bois and so on. I think there is something that is, what some people would call an intermediate goal between on the road toward overcoming capitalism. A multiracial
Right.
democracy, that phrase is out there, multiracial, gender inclusive, working class democracy, things like that. So I think there's some headway compared to pre 2016, where people, you know, there were various visions of what a very long range, something we might want, ideal or, ideal, but the mid range
Right.
was very, very difficult. I think we're a little better shape on that.
Right.
I like the work that.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I agree. Things are, like I said, it's the worst of times, it's the best of times. That's part of the best of times. Um, but it does need to go a good deal further. Um, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. It would be interesting to I would find it interesting to be able to talk with um, not just Sean Fain, but the people who really support him across labor, not just in the UAW, and to have a feeling for whether they see a path to better, and whether they're susceptible to cynicism or they are uh, instead excited and feeling that there's a path and that there could be they can envision organization in their communities. They can envision organization in their workplaces. That I'm not sure is there yet, but it could be. It's certainly not out of the question by any means. I mean, it's remarkable. That's not out of the question, and neither is fascism, um, which is very strange.
Well, I don't.
Uh,
It, I don't know how strange it is, when the existing system, the cracks are there, and the existing order starts to break down. You can get. I think what's
you do
different
get both
about the
sides.
right and the left, which is implicit in what you're saying, Michael, is that the right feels that it's pretty close to political power, and that
Yeah,
it could implement its program of repression, and all wealth to the wealthy, all energy to the fossil fuel industry. They feel if they can get full control of the government, they can make pretty much the country look like how they want it to look within a few years. Now, they may be wrong about that, but I
yeah,
think they feel that way.
right.
And I think that
Yeah, I think
most
so.
savvy people on the left recognize that we could get a start, we could get a good start toward a new progressive cycle, but it's going to take quite a long time before we get to a stage where something we might call getting close to overcoming capitalism is going to happen. So some history can move faster,
There,
but there's a lot of steps that have to go on. We don't have Fox News. We don't have uh, 400 people writing Project 2025 and immediately billions of dollars getting invested. We don't have the size of the congressional
yeah, we
delegation.
certainly can't mimic. That's for sure. uh,
We're not on there. They're bigger than
yeah,
us.
as to how long it'll take, we might disagree. I think that the duration of the process, let's call it, is an unknown, and is always if it's going to happen, right? If you're in a phase or a process that's going to succeed, it's not going to take that long. It's not going to take forever. It may fail. It may not get started, but one that is going to work, a process that's going to lead to change comparable to that right-wing change. That is a pretty fundamental set of changes throughout society, and then continuing on to totally new institutions. I don't think it would take that long. I think these things do move relatively quickly, but not without people being able to participate, wanting to participate, desiring to participate, and knowing enough, that is sharing enough understanding and vision to participate. But if all that was there, I do think it can move relatively quickly. Maybe that's just my, I'm still mired at the age of 20 in the 60s, but uh, I'm really, I was not too hot on we want the world and we want it now, um, as an organizing principle, and it's still not a good organizing principle. So when when the movement against ecological collapse says, well, we have to replace capitalism. If we don't do that, we can't stop global warming, and we're all doomed. They'd better be wrong, because I agree with you that we're not going to replace capitalism fast enough to deal with global warming and ecological collapse. We better be able to make, you know, changes in the meantime, and I think we certainly can, which mitigate and slow and even prevent that kind of ecological collapse, even though we haven't replaced, the basic underlying system yet.
Well, let's put it this
So
way.
that's sort of
You,
analogous
you
to we
mentioned
want the
right
world and we
about
want
the
it
time
now.
frame. I think I put it
I
this way.
what? I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
Um, the scale of both institutional change and attitudinal change that has to happen is large. Uh, we need a revamp of
True.
the political system toward a different way of practicing democracy, different economic institutions, and referring back to our earlier
All of it.
conversation, we need a whole bunch of people who right now are voting Republican to be at least supportive in a passive sense, if not of an active sense, of moving in a very different direction. How long those things would take to happen, I agree with you that they can happen pretty quickly under certain circumstances.
Yeah.
But we need to resist the temptation to skip some of those steps. If we do get
Well, that I agree.
a share of political power, the temptation to use that in shortcut ways and have it, not have your base understand what's happening and move with it and shortcut democracy, that's been a real problem in countries where the left has taken power. So it's not, you're right, it's not
Yeah.
really a question of how long or how short, but it is a question of not skipping over essential steps that have to be taken if you're going to have something on a firm foundation.
Yeah.
We probably agree
You
on that.
can't you can't succeed at what you don't even try to do. Um, the example that comes to mind for me is not only the United States, but say Venezuela, where um, during the Chavez period, there was a mood, and when I encountered it, I was astounded by it, that you don't go into the neighborhoods where you're not liked to organize. You go where you have support. So in other words, they had all these tremendous desires to create assemblies at the base and to replace the government with a federation of assemblies and so on. But they were averse to talking to people who disagreed with them, even on campuses, which is sort of incredible. But, or at least it seems to me it's incredible. It bypasses one of the key steps that you're talking about. And you do see the same thing in the U.S. left often. That's the dismissal of all Trump voters as unreachable scum or whatever it is that people have in their minds to describe half the population. Um, that is suicide for the left, I think. At least for the left that is really trying to change things fundamentally. So that has to be overcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it's just. I mean, I find it sort of amusing for people to talk about the need to have the working class fighting for a new world and then dismissing working people as unreachable. This is quite a combination, and it does exist, that combination, and that has to be gotten beyond. But if these things are gotten beyond, I do think that it doesn't take 100 years or 50 years or
Yeah.
30 years.
Like
Um, I
Lenin
mean,
said,
look at people moving for. First of all, look at Obama getting elected. Did you anticipate that?
no,
Come
no.
on, no, no, no. Of course, yet it happened, and it happened pretty quickly. And then look at the people who voted for Obama voting for Trump in no time flat, right? And is it because they're racist? Did they forget that they voted for this black guy to be president? I mean, what's going on? It's more subtle, all this stuff that's happening. And now all of a sudden, a black woman may well become president. These are real changes that are happening quickly, almost without coherent program and effort in some ways. Imagine coherent program and effort at work. I don't know. I'm still optimistic, even though I'm scared shitless of what's going to happen in November. It's just a schizoid state of mind, I guess.
Well, it's a good state of mind. I mean, that's you can't build a radical movement on fear. You have to build a radical movement on hope. I mean, that's not an original idea or anything like that. But you have to have a sense that you can prevail and that you can change things. Otherwise, I mean, another way of saying what you just said pretty well is if the left has a permanent opposition mentality, we'll never get anywhere.
Yeah,
Obviously, we have to be
yeah,
opposed to certain things. But if your mentality is we're a permanent opposition, we're always going to be the people who are against, it leads toward those kinds of pathologies of writing off people who don't agree with you and so on. If you take the mentality
and
that
you
we're
can
going to
even.
govern the country and we're going to build part of a majoritarian movement that's going to govern the country in the interests of everybody in the long term, then you can have a little bit different attitude toward people who don't agree with you along the way. And you can see why having a permanent opposition mentality is the natural state of a marginal group. And too many people on the left, it's not people's fault. We have been marginal for quite some time. You and I are old enough that we came out of a period where we weren't marginal. So at least whatever
Yeah,
plenty of things we did wrong. I wrote a whole book about a bunch of things we did wrong, or at least the part of the left I was
right,
in that
right.
I did wrong. But we had a taste of being part of a movement that was not marginal, that was majoritarian, that was had that kind of experience of seeing people change and come our way. So that imprinted
Yeah,
many of us. And without some feeling like that, even if you haven't had the benefit of directly experiencing it, but it's harder if you came up in since the Reagan years, where although there have been gains, for gay rights and like you said, the first black president, these are very important things. But in terms of the relative power of the left relative to the right, we've been sliding downhill for quite some time. So it's very difficult for people to
yeah.
break out of an opposition mentality. Um, and that's,
You can almost I mean, I even wonder sometimes, you can imagine with that oppositional mindset, the existence of the thing to be opposed to is sort of your identity in some sense, right? And you can feel that sometimes people on the left exaggerate the power of the other side, deny the possibility that change is happening, almost to retain their identity as hating this thing. You know, I mean, it seems that way to me at times. Is almost a vested interest in being weak, um, or if not a vested interest, at least a an expectation of it, and I don't know. At any rate, there is hope now. There is serious hope. It seems to me. I mean, even in the Democratic Party, which to me is anathema, and has been for my whole life. But at the convention, it seemed to me pretty obvious that the bulk of the people at that convention were well to the left of the people on the stage. It
Absolutely.
certainly seemed that way to me.
It's every
Hmm?
uh, that's true on everything. I mean, 60% of the Democratic voting
Yeah,
base thinks Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and a Democratic president
but
is
that's
financing it. Exactly. That's huge to build on for the future.
but these people were inside that building, right? These people were selected to come to the convention, to not be annoying, to to fit nicely, and they did. They raised their USA signs, and they did those. But you could see, or at least I felt it, that they were a little more moved toward progressive notions than anybody on the stage would have liked, or so it seemed to me anyway.
Yeah,
Uh, I'm not saying that's our future. That's not our future. The only reason that's the case is because of activity outside of that. But it does reflect the fact that there is an impact happening. Um,
absolutely. Absolutely. I think that the base of the Democratic Party, and by that I also mean the people who are active at the club level, at the state level, people who get
yeah,
elected to delegates, people who were Bernie delegates or Warren delegates in 2020, 2016. That layer of people, I mean, the indivisible didn't come out of the left. The indivisible thing came out of people who had been Democratic Party operatives, staffers, congressional staffers,
yeah,
lower level and mid level campaign consultants. I mean, we saw a bunch of people resign from, not a bunch, but at least a few resign from the Biden administration in protest of Gaza. And every one of them said, there's plenty of other people in there who feel this way. They just haven't yet been
yeah,
willing to resign. So I do think the
yeah. And there's a
challenge, we have a lot of people on our side, but institutionalizing that power, focusing on, winning some demands that then create momentum so you can win more. These are going to be big challenges for us immediately, assuming we make it through 2020 for election and protecting it.
2020, right,
What we
right.
focus on, what key wins can we get early on, wins that might neutralize some elements of the opposition, as well as get excitement in the bit more progressive forces. These are kinds of things we have to be thinking about. And you're absolutely right. You can't be thinking about them if you're just in an oppositional mood. You have to be thinking in that kind of forward looking way, or those kinds of questions
Yeah,
aren't even questions for you.
yeah.
Okay, we should form the Optimist Caucus,
Uh,
Michael. Yeah, keep hope alive. That's why Jesse's slogan of
but
"Keep Hope Alive" is it's a really good political slogan, and
he was right.
he was
Yeah,
absolutely right
yeah.
about
He
that.
was very smart. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think so. And well, we're closing on an hour. Um, Do you have something in particular that you want to bring up to cover before we end, or
Uh,
not?
I think we touched on a lot of pretty interesting things. I think at the end we should just reinforce the point that there's going to be a lot of surprises between now and November. And we need to find ways to try to keep up the pressure on foreign policy and not drop it, not ignore what's going on or underplay what's going on in Israel Palestine, even as we fight to win the election. And we need to try to avoid burning any bridges with people who we're going to disagree with, both people on the other side of the election and people within the left or within the anti-MAGA front that we disagree with. We have to keep our bridges open and not get ourselves in a bunker, which, that you've emphasized that throughout this discussion. And I think it's a really important point.
Yeah, yeah. Agreed. Um, all right. Well, thanks for coming on again, second time. And thanks for the stuff you've been writing. I have been a fan of it, I guess you could say, and tried to spread it around a little bit because I think it's good stuff. And that said, this is Mike Albert signing off until next time for Revolution Z.